In the following, I will speak of old age and the phenomenon of awakening. In one of the maxims of La Bruyère, we read, quote 1, "Life is a sleep. Old men are those whose sleep has been the longest. They begin to awake only when they must die." A different version we find in Marcel Proust's À la recherche du temps perdu. "When I woke up in the middle of the night, since I did not know where I was, I did not even understand at the first moment who I was. I had only, in its original simplicity, the feeling of existence as it may quiver in the depths of an animal. I was more destitute than a cave dweller, but then the memory would come to me like help to pull me from the abyss in which I would not have been able to escape on my own." This passage refers to a feeling of existence, and in the following I will specifically focus on this. Proust speaks of a childhood experience, but what does it mean to feel one's existence in old age? To discuss this, I will turn to one of the most acute psychologists of the phenomenon of awakening, namely the French philosopher François-Pierre Gontier, Maine de Biran, who lived between 1766 and 1824. Maine de Biran wrote many philosophical texts, but here I will only focus on his diary, his Journal intime, a text that he never meant to publish. It was only made public some years after his death. It is an important document because it is one of the first examples of the personal diary in French literature. He started writing it in 1792 when he was 26 years old and continued throughout his life. When reading this diary, we are reminded of what Michel Foucault has called technologies of the self, that is, practices whereby an individual represents to himself his own ethical self-understanding, where he contemplates and works on his own self. For Maine de Biran, his diary offered him a place to reflect on all those things he felt troubled by, be it his physical frailties, be it the despairingly miserable political situation in France in those years. Maine de Biran was a staunch royalist who had defended Versailles in 1789 as a member of the lifeguard of the King Louis XVI, or be it not least his extreme displeasure of growing old. These troubles he returns to ever and ever again in his diary, and he brings them up in order to ask the question, the key philosophical question, as he saw it, about what man must do in order to gain happiness. But this was a question he never really solved. In the following, I will concentrate on some passages written in the last years of his life. Thus, in August 1823, it should be, just 1 year before his death, Maine de Biran, at the age of 57, writes, quote 3, "I'm always dissatisfied with myself the moment I wake up and those that follow, just until my mind acquires full possession of the body and the spirit returns to its habitual doings. Before this happens, the immediate feeling of existence, or the pure sensitive synesthesis, differs from the apperception of the self in relation to the body. Because once the self is ready to receive impressions and the whole play of association of ideas joins the synesthesis, this latter become mixed with the rest, and a different feeling of existence is created, a mixed feeling which can be good, happy, and confident, whereas the initial feeling, which is the immediate effect of the sensitive dispositions, is sad, troublesome, full of distrust and fear. In youth there is an immediate pleasure attached to the sensitive synesthesis. Man is happy in feeling himself alive. He has less need of that artificial happiness which depends on the position, that is to say, all those remedies which are used to prolong and sustain a life which is closing in upon itself and soon to expire. I go through this difference every morning. Sad and miserably affected by life, I need ideas that relate to opinion, exterior resources, and artificial means in order to be reconciled with this life and to find some immediate pleasure. In this passage, there are three things I want to highlight. First, there is the mysterious term synesthesis. Secondly, he speaks about his old age and its so-called artificial happiness. And thirdly, he insists on the repetitiousness of the sadness experienced during the moments of awakening. This is something he feels always, toujours, each morning. So, what about the term synesthesis? It was coined by a German physiologist, Johann Christian Reil, and his pupil Hübner in the 1790s. It is derived from Greek koinon eisteterion. In German it would be Gemeinsinn. In English it would be the common sense. This common sense is different from the external senses, like sight, hearing, touch, taste, and smell. According to Reil, the inventor of the term, synesthesis points to the, quote, the means of which the soul is informed of the state of the body. That means that synesthesis is the sense that coordinates and unifies the signals provided to the mind by the various external senses. Building on this, Jean Starobinski simply sees it as an internal perception of our bodies, the perception where I feel my body and feel it as a unity. To my knowledge, Maine de Biran is the first to use this term in French. Elsewhere in his diary he calls it the sens vital, the living sense, or the vital sense. In other words, synesthesis is to him the sense whereby he feels himself alive, the sense that gives him a feeling of existence. During the moments of awakening, this feeling is immediate and not mixed with reflection, or what he calls a perception du soi, a perception of the self, of the ego. When we wake up, we have initially no idea of being an ego. This only comes later. Maine de Biran here anticipates what Paul Valéry would say about 100 years later in the next quote. One should not say, I wake, but there is waking. To the second point, namely his old age. According to Maine de Biran, the synesthesis is positive in youth but negative in old age when it is marked by sadness, distrust and anxiety. In this we find an implicit criticism of Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who in his famous Rêverie du promeneur solitaire had celebrated as sweet in itself what he called the feeling of existence, which was realized during his reveries. Maine de Biran rejects this view on grounds that in old age man cannot find any immediate or purely sensual pleasure of being alive. Sheer physical or sensual happiness is not accessible to the old. So for the old, the only way to sustain himself or oneself is by means of what he calls artificial happiness. Bonheur artificiel, brought about by artificial and exterior means. But now the question is, what are these artificial and exterior means? If the old man or woman cannot be realistically or authentically happy, but only artificially happy, what must he do to be so? And will this artificial happiness be enough? Be enough to make him content? To this last question, Maine de Biran seems to answer no. Artificial happiness is not enough. It is only of limited value. In his diary, he also criticizes Cicero, who in his famous De Senectute had argued that old age is a good time of life since it gives the old an aura of moral authority, dignity and superiority that make them become admired by the younger generation. However, Maine de Biran sees Cicero's argument as dubious because the Roman writer does not take into due consideration the factual bodily problems of old age, and instead only highlights those dimensions whose function seems to be to stimulate the vanity, the amour-propre of the old persons. What Cicero calls a good old life is a life whose happiness relies solely on the way the old person sees himself loved and admired by his surroundings. To Maine de Biran, this is the same as artificial happiness, something that is not a true happiness, since it does not have its source in the individual himself, but only in his effect on his surroundings. So now we come to the third point, namely that we are here dealing with a diary. A diary is a text that documents daily experiences, and the moment of awakening could in many ways be said to be the most daily experience there is, as it forms the precondition of living a day-to-day existence. Maine de Biran returns to this phenomenon at several occasions. And then, quote 5, "When waking up, I first, according to my old habits, turn to my imagination, to my sensibility. I ask them if they know of anything that would make a pleasurable or worthwhile preoccupation for the day that is about to start. They remain silent and veiled in their sadness, as if veiled by a cloud." And another one, "Waking up from a more or less agitated sleep, I feel immediately sad, bored, and battered. The sleep has changed the course of my thoughts. It seems that by sleeping I have lost all intellectual and moral support. Et somnus noctis immutat scientiam eius." Maine de Biran had started to write his diary because he felt himself to be unstable and ever-changing, and he hoped that the diary would offer the possibility of establishing an identity he sorely missed. However, as these quotations show, the sleep always distorts his sense of identity, offering no clarity to the old man. Just as we saw in Proust, awakening is a crisis moment where the writer at first does not know who he is and desperately searches for his own former self. From passages like these, it's easy to conclude that Maine de Biran's diary confirms the well-known narrative of old age as decline. However, this is not so simple. In the very last years of his life, Maine de Biran, who had in youth been an atheist, became increasingly inspired by Christian ideas and developed a belief that the commentators have often described as religious mysticism. Of particular note is his reflections about the so-called third life, la troisième vie. The old Maine de Biran dreamed of reaching this so-called third life, which he presented as a total renunciation of his previous existence, his previous personality. To reach this third life, he had to both reject the so-called first life of animal sensualism and the second life of human rationalism. The third life, on the contrary, was the life of the Holy Spirit as he saw it. In the last notes of his diary, which are increasingly dominated by the tone and intention of prayer, Maine de Biran seeks to transform himself in order to gain this so-called third life, which he thinks will give him happiness. Some years earlier, he had noted, quotation 8, "One gets older, one has the feeling of weakness, languor, of malaise, which derive from the process of aging. One sees oneself as ill, thinking that the illness derives from a specific cause from which one hopes to get better. Vain belief. The illness is nothing else than old age, and old age is miserable. One cannot do anything else than resign oneself to it. The only hope one has of getting better is to gradually distance oneself from and forget the ideas of youth. For it is the contrast and the passage between youth and old age and the feeling that we grow old which make us so unhappy. When we are really old, that is to say, having died away from youth, we are less unhappy. So concludingly, we can say that the attempt to die away from his former self marks the basic religious quest of the old Maine de Biran. But how successful is this attempt? This is also, of course, a question of his diaristic writing. Maine de Biran continued to write his diary almost to his dying day, and it could be argued that by writing it, he only confirmed and consolidated the very self that he at the same time wanted to escape from. A further suggestion of this paradox is Maine de Biran's frequent references to his so-called inner enemy, and his argument that those that seek to analyze themselves are more likely to come into contact with this inner enemy than those that don't. Constantly writing about himself, being the psychologist of his own self, obviously did not bring Maine de Biran any happiness. Reading his diary is puzzling. When we think of old age and literary writers from this period, we usually think of Rousseau and perhaps Chateaubriand, that is to say, individualists who were able to describe and idealize their own aging self, and who also developed their own idiosyncratic old age style or late style. But the interesting aspect of Maine de Biran's diary is that it is styleless, and that the writer does not seek to represent himself or his old age in colors so as to make an impression on others. Certainly he was not an artist or a virtuoso of his old age, but I would also add that he was not a philosopher of old age. Perhaps the only serious philosophy of old age is Stoicism, which argues that the old should learn to die and look at human life as only a comedy of no specific importance. However, if Maine de Biran was in some aspects stoic in his mind, his constant pains due to his weak physical condition also led him to criticize Stoicism on grounds that it was impossible to ignore the signals of his own body. The Stoics, of course, believed that the body was only a superficial element that did not really concern or belong to the immortal soul of man. So what was Maine de Biran? Perhaps not surprisingly, I would call him a diarist of old age. By this I mean that perhaps as one of the very first in world literary history, Maine de Biran presented his old age as not only a subjective, but a daily occurrence. And more fundamentally, that old age was something immensely intrusive, and whose bleak reality visited him each and every morning he woke up, or when he woke up, something with which he had to grapple with each day as the painful intrusiveness of repetitious chronology. His diary tells us of old age as perhaps a sad and impudent, ostentatious angel whose reign renews itself each and every morning. Thank you.